In the brutal world of the Middle Ages, not every weapon earned a place in the hands of warriors. Some were so effective, so disruptive, that rulers and city councils tried to erase them from the battlefield. This is the story of one such weapon. A simple tool turned into a lethal equalizer, feared by knights, banned in laws, and remembered as a symbol of how quickly power could change in war. Number 1. What made the guisarme particularly feared? Born from farm work rather than a knight's armory, the guisarme began as a pruning hook on a stout pole, and morphed into a battlefield problem no horseman could ignore. Its geometry did the talking, a forward curving blade that bit like a sickle, often paired with a thrusting spike, and in some variants, a back hook to yank. That mix let an infantryman choose his effect in a heartbeat hook to unseat a rider, edge to slice tendons, or reach around a shield rim, spike to punch into gaps in mail or between plates. Crucially, the weapon asked less of its user than a sword or a bow. You didn't need years at a pell, or a lifetime of draw strength. With 2 days of drill and a steady stance behind a line of comrades, a levy could learn to catch reins, pull a destrier sideways, and finish the job as the formation closed. Affordability mattered just as much as capability. Blacksmiths could adapt agricultural iron to a guisarme head quickly, and wooden shafts were local and replaceable. Town arsenals stocked racks of them because they solved municipal problems. Hold a narrow street, deny a gate, break up a mounted patrol without spending like a prince. In field battles, guisarme companies slotted neatly into mixed ranks beside spears. Frontmen braced points while second and third ranks reached over with hooks, turning a smooth cavalry pass into a tangle of fouled tack and flailing legs. That reliability forced tactical adjustments. Cavalry approached at angles, screened by skirmishers, or waited for archers to thin the hookmen first. Knights learned the hard way that armor didn't protect a horse's joints or a rider's balance. A hooked pull at speed could do what a blade often couldn't: remove the rider from the fight without piercing him at all. Because it empowered common infantry and undercut the economics of knightly warfare, authorities tried to fence it in. Town statutes limited civilians from carrying hook-headed polearms at fairs. Watch ordinances confiscated them inside walls unless on duty. Lists for tourneys and formal combats excluded hooked weapons, as contrary to chivalric display. Militia exemptions and border emergencies made those rules patchy, but the pattern is clear. Wherever elites wanted predictable, gentlemanly violence, the guisarme's utility looked subversive. Add its role in urban uprisings and frontier ambushes, and you get a reputation that stuck cheap to make, quick to learn, terrifyingly effective at the exact things mounted elites prized. That is why the guisarme, more than a peasant's tool repurposed, became the polearm that authorities repeatedly tried to push out of polite war. Number 2. Growing pressure for a ban. The guisarme's journey from field tool to feared battlefield weapon made it both practical and politically troubling. At first, it was just a pruning hook on a long pole, meant for cutting branches and clearing hedges. Peasants discovered that with minor changes, it could become a deadly arm. The hook could pull a knight from his saddle. The blade could slash reins or hamstring a horse. A thrusting spike on some versions could punch through gaps in armor. The design was simple, the parts cheap, and no special forge or long training was needed. Any rural smith could make the head from agricultural iron, and any carpenter could fix it to a shaft. That simplicity was exactly what made it spread so quickly, and why it began to alarm the ruling class. In the medieval order, the mounted knight was meant to dominate the battlefield. Years of training, costly armor, and a warhorse bred for combat gave him a clear edge over common fighters. The guisarme undermined that advantage. A disciplined group of foot soldiers with these weapons could resist a cavalry charge and even bring down elite riders. Chroniclers serving noble patrons painted the guisarme as crude and dishonorable. To them, it belonged to peasants, rebels, and town militias, not to the proper world of chivalric combat. This wasn't just snobbery. It was also fear of what widespread use could mean for power balance. If commoners could arm themselves cheaply and still stand against knights, the traditional social order was at risk. By the late 13th century, written rules began to target the weapon. No church council issued a sweeping moral condemnation like it did for crossbows, but local and regional authorities took action. Town statutes often prohibited carrying hooked polearms in public spaces such as markets, festivals, and fairs. Watch ordinances allowed them only for citizens on official guard duty. In some places, these weapons were banned outright within city walls, unless stored in the arsenal. Tournaments also excluded them, not only for safety, but because they broke the visual and tactical norms of the event. Chivalric contests valued symmetry and control. The guisarme's hook encouraged grappling, dragging, and horse-pulling moves seen as messy and dangerous to the honor of the sport. Feudal lords sometimes ordered their levies to show up with approved polearms such as spears, glaives, or halberds, pointedly excluding the guisarme. These orders served two purposes. They standardized equipment for more predictable battlefield tactics, and they reduced the chance that a levy could use his weapon in a rebellion or street fight. In cities, the same reasoning drove restrictions. Authorities linked the guisarme to riots, guild disputes, and political uprisings. When urban unrest broke out, militia records often noted the presence of hooked polearms. Their ability to control narrow streets and threaten mounted patrols made them effective in such conflicts. Enforcement varied. In some cities, guards checked weapons at the gates, forcing people to leave guisarmes in storage before entering. On market days, officials patrolled to ensure no one carried them openly. In other places, the rules were loose, and frontier towns still issued guisarmes for garrison duty because of their effectiveness against cavalry and in holding choke points. Even where bans existed, wars often made them irrelevant. Commanders valued the guisarme in sieges and in defensive lines, and they were willing to ignore local laws if it meant having better odds in battle. Despite this inconsistency, the overall pattern is clear. The guisarme became a focus for legal and social control because it blurred the line between soldier and civilian, between defense and revolt. It was cheap enough for anyone to own, easy enough for anyone to use, and effective enough to challenge the most powerful force on the medieval battlefield. Authorities didn't always succeed in removing it from use, but their repeated attempts to restrict it show how deeply it threatened both military strategy and the social order. Over time, this constant pressure built a reputation for the guisarme as not just another polearm, but as a dangerous equalizer one that those in power preferred to keep out of ordinary hands. Number 3. How enforcement played out in practice. Across medieval Europe, the way authorities enforced restrictions on the guisarme depended heavily on location, politics, and social structure. In larger towns with strong guild control, the weapon faced tighter limits. Local statutes often banned carrying it in markets, during religious festivals, or in processions where crowds gathered. Officials feared that a weapon designed to hook, pull, and topple could quickly turn a heated argument into a deadly riot. City watchmen patrolled gates and streets, inspecting weapons brought inside. Hooked or barbed polearms were seized unless the bearer had explicit permission, such as being on guard duty or in an official militia. Fines were common, and repeat offenders could face loss of guild privileges or even imprisonment. Yet the same towns kept racks of guisarmes in their arsenals, ready to issue to garrisons defending walls, guarding gates, or patrolling during times of unrest. This dual approach reflected a practical mindset: limit civilian misuse while preserving military readiness. In rural areas, enforcement was looser. Lords, reeves, and local officials had fewer resources to control every village. When levies were called up, men brought the weapons they already owned. Some captains encouraged standardized gear like spears or bills for easier drilling, but others allowed guisarmes if they increased the unit's effectiveness against mounted opponents. In areas where horse breeding was vital to the local economy, however, guisarmes were sometimes discouraged or banned to protect the value of cavalry. The weapon's ability to unseat riders and injure horses was seen as both an asset in war and a liability in peacetime. The case of Flanders stands out. There, urban militias made heavy use of guisarmes alongside pikes, crossbows, and the godendag. At the Battle of the Golden Spurs in 1302, Flemish townsmen armed with such weapons famously defeated French knights. This was more than a battlefield victory. It was a direct challenge to the social hierarchy. Infantry from the towns had humbled the mounted elite, showing that discipline, numbers, and effective weapons could overturn the established order. After this, neighboring rulers became far more wary of militias equipped with guisarmes. Some introduced stricter controls, limiting their use to formal campaigns under noble command. Others banned them entirely from civilian possession, except under license. Bans were expressed in various ways. Some towns prohibited carrying polearms after dark. Others demanded that long weapons be stored at the city gate before entry, to be retrieved on departure. Tournaments and judicial duels often excluded guisarmes because of their disruptive nature in controlled combat. The hooked head could catch a shield, pull an opponent off balance, or injure a horse, undermining the formalized choreography of knightly contests. In civic law, guisarmes were often grouped with other riot arms that could not be brought into public gatherings without approval. Even with these restrictions, enforcement was far from uniform. On frontier settlements or during sieges, the guisarme remained a favored weapon. It was effective in defending narrow streets, repelling ladders, or fighting from behind palisades. In these contexts, the priority was survival, not adherence to civic regulations. This led to a pattern of selective enforcement strict in peacetime within urban centers, permissive during wartime, or in remote regions where cavalry threats were real. Italian communes developed some of the most structured approaches. Cities like Milan or Bologna allowed guisarmes for militia drills, specific guard posts, or rural patrols, but forbade them in street patrols during festivals or political assemblies. The rules often specified when, where, and by whom the weapon could be carried. Violating these conditions could result in confiscation, fines, or loss of militia status. Similar patterns appeared in parts of England, where local bylaws reflected the Statute of Northampton's spirit by limiting public arms bearing, while allowing militia and watchmen to remain equipped. Over time, military contracts and indentures began to standardize infantry weapons, favoring forms that worked predictably in formation. The guisarme's many regional variations made it harder to regulate and train with compared to the more uniform bill or spear. Some commanders saw this as a reason to phase it out. Others, recognizing its utility in certain terrain and against cavalry, kept it as a specialist tool. Ultimately, the enforcement story reveals the weapon's awkward position. It was too useful to vanish completely, yet too closely linked to unpredictable, crowd-driven violence to be tolerated without limits. Authorities sought to control not only the guisarme itself, but also who could use it, when, and for what purpose. This blend of regulation and retention shows a recurring medieval balancing act, maintaining public order while keeping the most effective tools close at hand for moments when defense of the community or the lord's authority demanded them. In the guisarme's case, that balance never resolved cleanly, ensuring its place as both a practical arm and a politically sensitive one for centuries. Number 4. Why the guisarme mattered in medieval warfare evolution. The guisarme's history captures a turning point in how medieval wars were fought and who had the power to fight them. It began as an agricultural implement, but in the hands of common soldiers, it became a polearm that could threaten the most prestigious force of the age, the mounted knight. Its hooked blade could pull a rider from the saddle, drag shields aside, or disable a horse by cutting its legs. Unlike the sword or lance, which required years of training and significant wealth, the guisarme could be mastered quickly and produced cheaply. This meant that military effectiveness was no longer tied entirely to noble privilege. Infantry units, once seen as secondary to cavalry, now had the means to break charges and defend positions with far more confidence. This changed tactics on both sides. Commanders who relied on cavalry could no longer commit to headlong charges without first dispersing or outflanking infantry armed with guisarmes. They began integrating more missile troops, altering the angles of attack, or coordinating with light cavalry to harass and weaken infantry lines before contact. On the infantry side, the weapon encouraged the development of mixed formations, where spears held the front and guisarmes reached over the top to hook and strike, giving common soldiers a more active and decisive battlefield role. Its impact went beyond tactics. Socially, the guisarme represented a redistribution of martial capability. The monopoly on effective violence, once the domain of the knightly elite, was eroded by a weapon that empowered urban militias, guild levies, and peasant foot soldiers. In towns, its presence in arsenals meant that political power could shift in times of unrest, as those same militias could challenge or defend against noble forces. This was part of a broader trend in the late Middle Ages, where cities became more militarily self-reliant, and where military success could elevate the political influence of non-nobles. The guisarme became one of several weapons alongside pikes, bills, and crossbows that symbolized the rise of organized infantry as a dominant force. The attempts to ban or restrict the guisarme were not just about the weapon's physical danger, but about controlling who could use it and under what circumstances. In this sense, the guisarme sits at the intersection of technology and authority. Military leaders valued its effectiveness in sieges and defensive positions, but civic and feudal authorities feared its role in uprisings and street fighting. Restrictions often reflected this duality. It might be issued freely to guards during wartime, then locked away when peace returned. This pattern reveals the deeper shift it represented. Once a tool that could change the outcome of battles was in the hands of commoners, the entire system of feudal military dominance had to adapt. In the long run, the guisarme's story parallels the broader transformation of medieval warfare. By the 14th and 15th centuries, infantry with polearms became the core of many armies, and the prestige of the mounted knight began to wane. The weapon's combination of reach, hooking ability, and cutting power made it a natural fit for the changing battlefield, where disciplined ranks of foot soldiers could decide the fight. The push to restrict it is a clear sign of how threatening this shift was to traditional power structures. When technology and training combined to put effective force in the hands of those outside the aristocracy, warfare became less about ritualized knightly combat and more about practical, collective killing power. The guisarme, in that sense, was more than a weapon. It was a signal that war was becoming a domain where class boundaries mattered less than skill, coordination, and access to the right tools. This reality forced both military strategy and medieval society to evolve, leaving the guisarme as a lasting symbol of the moment when foot soldiers began to stand on equal terms with mounted elites.